Hello everyone. Today we're going to look at chapter 4, which is all about books. Books are the mass communication that gave rise to all others. They were the first. And in recent years, with digital formats taking hold, the book industry is struggling like every other print media. The year the big numbers dropped for everybody was 2008. And since then, many bookstores have closed and layoffs have been common, and online retailers took huge hits. But the book industry has a more positive prognosis for recovery than most other print media because people are still reading. They're just using new and different devices to do it, like ebooks, e-readers. And so books are in a really good position to transfer over to digital formats. The main difference in the business model for the book industry than other print media is that they don't rely on advertising to get readers. And they don't have the huge overhead of printing presses. They're not these huge all-encompassing entities in the production process like newspapers. So books are published through publishing houses, which is like a company with a brand name that produces books. And publishing companies do not have huge investments in printing of the books. Historically, they've contracted these services out to other companies that specialize in printing only, and so those printing companies are the ones who really absorbed the cost of not printing books in the digital transition. So in this respect, it may actually save book companies money to not print. Book companies don't rely on selling ad space to produce their products. They rely on book sales. And then this widely accessible format of the internet has really lended itself to this business model. And then the bookstores absorb the cost of that, so that's why the bookstores have gone out of business. There's no bookstore equivalent to online, so there's not that much competition for selling and distributing. There's a big lack of competition in the book industry, which kind of gives companies free rein over the market for now. So nobody really knows what will happen and what the size and the scope or the shape that the book industry will take after this transition. And there will be some hazards and innovations, and then there will probably be a strong model that emerges to secure books as a viable media format. And what's happening is that a lot of companies are consolidating and merging and acquiring one another. So it seems certain that in the future, we probably won't have that many standalone companies, but there will be these conglomerate companies that sell books. So let's look at how books came about, and we'll start with the history of writing. About 3500 BC is where writing originated in Egypt or Mesopotamia. So spoken language is thought to be about 40,000 years old, but we didn't figure out how to record our ideas until about 5,500 years ago. And this just made it possible for us to store information for the first time, and people didn't have to memorize everything. So while certain people, like the elite class of scribes and the highly educated public figures like religious institutions and governments, which were often the same entity, were taught to write and educated in that way. But the first forms of communication were pictographs, which are pictures that represent ideas, and these are like cave drawings of animals and that type of thing. Ideographs were the next major development in written communication, and these are symbols that stand for a certain word, like we see in Chinese and Japanese language. It's a more expressive language, but there's so many words that it can really be difficult to learn and memorize how to write in that way. For example, literary Chinese has 50,000 symbols. So that's a lot of stuff to memorize. Ideographs are also what we use on signage when we communicate a single idea in a lot of different languages, like using a gas pump picture to indicate that there's gas on a certain exit, or a picture of a toilet instead of writing toilet in many different languages. In about 2000 BC, phonography began to take root, and symbols started to stand for sounds instead of individual ideas. And this form of language was easier to learn because there were less symbols to memorize, and they could be combined in many ways to create a wide range of ideas. And then in 1700 to 1500 BC, the alphabet took hold, and this was just a much simpler system. There were individual letters that stood for sounds, and there was only a few dozen of them that had to be memorized in order to create really complex ideas. And when the alphabet became more accessible, the position of the scribe became less elite because more people could learn how to write with this simpler form. So as writing became more common, people needed things to write on. And before paper, people wrote on clay tablets and cave walls and rocks, which is not very efficient. And so the innovation of paper just revolutionized and spread the trend of writing. The Egyptians developed papyrus around 3100 BC, which was rolled up into scrolls and very portable. And then parchment came after that. It replaced papyrus because it was a lot more durable, and it was made from goat and sheepskin. Then in about 240 to 105 BC, paper made from cotton and wood was developed in China, and the paper making process spread throughout Europe during the 1300s. But parchment was still more popular until the printing press came about in the 1500s. The earliest books were scrolls. Then, between 400 and 800 AD, monks were copying religious texts in rooms called scriptoria onto parchment. Many Greek and Latin books were lost during this time because parchment was so difficult to make that the monks would just erase previous texts and scribe a new one on it. And when they would scribe these books, they would use an original copy that was called an exemplar to create a new book from. And because scribes were part of a religious institution, most texts were of a religious nature. So the rise in the amount of books also boosted up literacy rates in the 13th century, and the demand for books began to grow. And the monks were unable to keep up with that demand, and so the publishing house was born. And the books were still hand copied, but they were done by licensed publishers and then distributed to the public. And the Canterbury Tales came out of this era. It was originally hand copied from an exemplar, and it's actually still in print today. So a huge revolution took place in 1455 with Gutenberg's movable metal type printing press. So no longer did books have to be hand scribed. They could be printed, and this was just the first time that the written word could be mass produced, and it was the birth of mass communication on a huge scale. So the impact of the printing press moved relatively slow at first. Language became standardized through books. Everybody started deciding which was right and wrong way to write things, to print them. And literacy rates rose and rose and rose because there was more to read, and ideas started flowing out to the masses that had never been shared before. And the printing press was a major factor in the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, who founded the Lutheran Church, was a German monk who in 1522 translated the New Testament of the Bible into German. And he did this so that ordinary people could read it. And this was a huge, huge transformation within the church, because the common people could interpret the Bible personally for the first time themselves. And the church was no longer in this gatekeeper of knowledge position, and it caused this revolution. So These innovations spread far and wide through science and religion and language and philosophy, and it formed this communication pathway between time and space, which began a chain of radical changes in society and communities everywhere. Mass media was one of the first industries in the New World in the colonies. The first printing press showed up in 1539, but it was in Mexico City. And actually, the Spanish were producing books 100 years before the colonies even started. They had about 40 titles before the colonies were founded. And then finally, in 1640, North America began printing some religious texts, which became widely popular, and they even exported them back to Europe. Then Benjamin Franklin, who was kind of a media tycoon of the early days, about 1731, he established the first library, but the patrons had to pay to view the books. Mass production of books began to pick up speed. About 1814, the steam-powered rotary press changed the speed of printing. Printers were turning out, before the press, they were turning out about 350 pages a day. After the introduction of the steam-powered press, they could print 16,000 sections a day, not pages. So that was just this huge, huge leap. And printing gained even more momentum with the invention of linotypesetting machine, which allowed a printer to use a keyboard type of device to enter text instead of hand setting each line of text. Then in the 1830s and 1840s, serial novels became very popular, and these were novels that were done in installments, and this installment model allowed printers to lower the cost for the audience so they could purchase them in pieces, and they didn't have to purchase the entire text at one time, and it was cheaper. Then during the Civil War, the popularity of dime novels, which sold for as little as a nickel, it rose. So they got very, very popular, and it was because dime novels classically celebrated heroes and action and democratic ideals, and all of this appealed to the wartime soldiers, and it helped them help the morale of the soldiers during the Civil War. So the speed in printing led to lower costs, which equaled growth of readership, a growth in literacy rates, and ideals began to spread out to the masses. The growth in the printed media industry led to a growth in demand, so each just fueled each other. Literacy rose, demand for books rose, the amount of books being printed rose, so everything just fueled each other, and books really took off. The traditional model in the book business, you have three major players. You have the publisher, who buys the book or the manuscript from the author and limitedly markets them, not very much, but they market them a little bit. And then the author, of course, who writes the book. And then you have the booksellers, and that includes wholesalers and retailers. It's basically anybody in the middle there, all the way to the end, who gets the book from the publisher to the audience in some way. So let's look at some of the different types of publishers. In the 1920s, the 20 largest companies were responsible for about 50% of published books, and then the rest were done by these smaller independent companies. As the trend in all media towards international conglomerates, buying up smaller companies, spread through all the different types of media, the book business followed suit. And 20 companies publish nearly 80% of all of our books today. So consolidation in the publishing industry is an ongoing trend, but there is still small companies that exist, like universities and small presses, which they usually cover specialized topics and issue limited numbers of publications. The publications from smaller print houses are usually funded by a university or an organization, and they're usually not for profit. They're usually scholarly texts and special subject areas, but occasionally you have a novel or another type of book that kind of squeaks through the system. The Your book cites A River Runs Through It, which was an English teacher, English professor from Chicago, and it came through University of Chicago Publishing House. And then also The Hunt for Red October, which was published by the Naval Institute Press. A vanity press prints books for an author, but the author covers all the expenses, and the author doesn't get paid unless the book sells. So it's just a self-publishing, and it's become a lot easier to do this in the age of the internet. We have publish on demand capabilities. If we write something, we can go get a copy of it printed up pretty easily and sell it to someone. People self-publish usually when they can't find a publisher, or they have information about something really specialized like a hobby or an instruction manual, that type of thing. Or if they're making a gift for people, sometimes people make picture books or scrapbooks, that kind of thing. Or another reason to self-publish would be to give yourself credibility as a writer, because if you have something published, you have something published, and you can say, here, I've written this book, here it is. The federal government is actually one of the biggest publishers in the nation, and they publish reports and booklets and documenting papers. And they actually have a few bestsellers like the 9/11 Commission Report and the Warren Commission Report about JFK's assassination and the Pentagon Papers. The government has about 300,000 publications online, and about 50% of all of their documents are now in electronic versions only with no paper backup. So think about that for a minute. Our government has 50% of their published documents online with no hard copy. It's a pretty interesting statistic. So let's look at the authors. The authors are the producers of everything, and sometimes they're profitable, but very, very few are stars, like Stephen King and J.K. Rowling. So it's kind of a business with a lot of work and usually very little payout. One of the reasons, though, that books can be so profitable is because they have such low overhead. And the low overhead is created by outsourcing all the production, and there's a limited promotional campaign for books usually, and there's limited advertising to promote them. Books are usually better marketed through things like the New York Times bestseller list or Oprah's book club, and just being available. And also word of mouth marketing sells books. So if people recommend a book, another person will read it. So let's take a look at this infographic. It's from your book, and it just talks about the very slow process of writing a book. It takes about 20 months to get from the proposal to selling it to the audience. First, the author, number one, they have to write the proposal and give in and send in sample chapters to the publisher. Then the publisher buys the book, and then they pay the author the first half of their advance. And then the author finishes writing the book, and they deliver it to the publisher, and then the author has to revise the book, and when it's accepted, they are paid the second half of the advance. Then it goes into production, and the cover is designed and it's made to look how it's going to look. And then the author reads and corrects the proof again. And then the book is printed and distributed to all the bookstores, and then it can be purchased. And that's when the author finally gets paid royalties for what they've written. And the royalties that they get are usually minus the advance that they received in the beginning. So it's kind of like these publishing houses are getting off free if the book sells. So like I said, this takes about 20 months, so it's a very slow process to go through publishing a book. So booksellers are the part at the very end, the last player in the business, and there are a few different types, so we're going to look at those. We have wholesalers and distributors, like Ingram Books, who's the largest wholesaler in the nation, and they distribute books to 43,000 publishers and 30,000 retail outlets, including Amazon.com, wholesalers and distributors are where bookstores and online companies get their books from. Places like major bookstore chains, Borders and Barnes and Noble. These are known as brick and mortar stores, but most have an online store as well. And like we've seen in Rapid City recently, they're closing their doors frequently. We had our Borders shut down, but then bam, replaced them right away. And then you have independent booksellers that belong to American Booksellers Association and mail order book clubs, which is a pretty old retail venue for books, but they've also ran into a lot of competition with the internet in recent years. And pretty much every cog in the wheel on the way down has started losing ground to online companies like Amazon.com and e-readers, like Nook and Kindle. So there's really not that much competition for digital downloads and audiobooks and online ordering. So most retailers have just kind of joined the herd in this digital transition and offer digital copies as well. The textbook business, as you all have probably recently been affected by in your pocketbooks, is a behemoth in the book business. Textbook companies differ from other types of companies because the people who select the books that will be purchased are different from the people who have to buy them, who have to pay for them. So, because this business can be very, very profitable, companies like Barnes and Noble have gotten the game by setting up campus divisions of their stores, and they're actually set up on more than 625 campuses currently. The Government Accountability Office found that students spend an average of $900 a year on textbooks, and between 1986 and 2004, there's been an incredible inflation in the price of school materials, and it's over twice the overall rate of inflation. So textbook sales profits get cut up into money for the school, money for the publishers, money for the authors, and also the cost has increased because they have to have an online presence for many books now, like websites and software to support the book. A lot of schools are trying to lower these costs for students in a variety of ways through keeping library copies on reserve, book rentals, digital versions, and used books. Most companies discourage used book sales because they don't make anything off of them. So censorship of books has been a hot issue in society. Books have a lot of power to really incite feelings in their readers and teach people complex ideas and present information in a very complete way. They can communicate intricate concepts about our humanness in ways that other mediums cannot. And so historically, it's led to fear in society in some cases and strong opposition to some written texts. Most censorship and banning of books in the United States is just done on a local level. It's not done by the government. And what happens is they just get removed from libraries or they're taken out of school curriculum. But on a global level, authors face anything from jail to death threats. And a name that has come up recently in the news, again with the current protests going on about the anti-Muslim film, Salman Rushdie wrote a book called Satanic Verses, and it was a religious satire allegory, and it was extremely offensive to Muslims. And it was first banned in India in '88, which caused rioting in Pakistan in 1989. It ruined his marriage, and then the Ayatollah of Iran put a fatwa out on him, which is a death sentence for blasphemous content. Rushdie had to go into hiding until the fatwa was lifted around 1998 after the Ayatollah died, but he's still in danger from violence of activists. So books can really stoke a lot of emotion in people, and they're a powerful medium. So now the future of books is forming with long-tail companies like Amazon offering a huge selection of different titles from one source, and it can cater to all these different types of customers. And the book industry has really tried to remain viable by going down a lot of different avenues and new directions and simpler business models. So they've had their ups and downs, but they really seem to be pulling through as an industry that's going to move into the future. One way that publishers are saving money is with print on demand, which is just what it sounds like. The publishers won't stock publications like they used to, and they'll print a book when it's ordered. There's a new machine called an espresso book machine that's been popping up in some places where you can actually have the machine print you a book on demand. So in class we'll look at a video about that. So technology has just had this huge impact on the book industry, but it's really not devastated it like other forms of print media. Ebooks, digital books paid for online are really growing in popularity, and it's actually cutting the cost of printing. So e-readers are on the rise, and they've further helped this cause by making books easily accessible on the web and made them easy to read with new screen technologies like on the Kindle. So basically, the next generation of books is emerging, and in class we'll look at some innovative companies like Pushpop Press, and we'll look at this print-on-demand espresso book machine, which is pretty interesting. Well, thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing all of you in class, and have a great day. So here are your study guide questions for Chapter 4. How did the development of the printing press change the world in the 15th and 16th century? What is the difference between ideographs, pictographs, and phonography, and which came first? What is the Postal Act of 1879? And why is the transition to a digital format easier for books?